mean, their after effects are very similar.
Yeah. Yeah, why are the after effects of psychedelics and alien abduction experiences the same?
Right, right.
Anyway, it's interesting.
And why do people on psychedelics sometimes see grays?
Yeah, there we go. We're back into it. It doesn't take long to realize it's all interconnected.
Yeah, yeah. And in all of those cases, lights play an important part too. I mean, a lot of times the first step in a UFO experience is a light. And, you know, the near-death experience often involves light.
Yeah, lights at the end of the tunnel.
I mean, not all of them. Some of them are very negative and dark, but I mean, there are a good number of them seem to involve light. Light just seems to play a part in all this in a way that we really don't have a comprehension of.
And just sticking with the idea of light and, you know, photosynthesis and just another connection with plants, how we all rely on plants as the primary producers because they are able to transform light into basically usable energy, which we eat through, you know, all the food that we eat. So light is clearly important on lots of different levels, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Very interesting.
One of the chapters deals with the idea of mycelium as a living network, and I find that really interesting.
Yes, it is, yeah. Basically, the idea is that forest ecosystems below the surface, all of the trees are connected together with this fungus called a mycelium. It's called a mycorrhizal fungus. And basically, they connect onto the tips of roots and extend the reach of roots so that roots can get nutrients. And then coming back to this idea of the importance of the sun, because fungi don't photosynthesize, so they have to use the energy that is given to them by the plants. They form a relationship with the roots of the plants so that the fungus can get energy from the plants, and in exchange, the fungus gives the plant greater access to nutrients that are further around. It's very interesting. It's like a mutually beneficial reciprocal relationship.
And you find that in nature, and it kind of goes against the idea of survival of the fittest.
Yeah, it does. It suggests that there is, you know, cooperation in nature is just as important as competition, basically. That plants and fungi and animals work together, basically, to create the conditions for maximum biodiversity. And that's what we've kind of, you know, what we are seeing the destruction of at the moment is the maximum biodiversity. We're preventing natural processes from taking their natural course, and that's leading to a collapse of the system.
Yeah.
Bad.
And, you know, of course, it's the bees are one of the things people are most aware of dying out, which probably has a number of causes behind of it. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, you know, when you hit a certain level of society, greed is the norm. Mm-hmm. You know, and these big corporations and stuff, they don't care that they're wiping this stuff out. It's not important to them as long as they're making money. And you know, they're very good at pitting us against each other while they just kind of sit back and watch. Yeah.
Yes, unfortunately. I mean, that's just totally off topic, but it just makes me think of all of the stuff that's going on here in the UK at the moment with our prime ministers and Brexit and all of that stuff. Don't want to get into that. Anyway.
Right.
Yes. But there are definitely vested interests up there who are, you know, more interested in money than the planet.
Yeah. And if we lose the bees, we lose potentially everything.
Yeah. We need to get back to basics, back to the soil, build from the soil upwards.
And the other thing about bees, I think even Darwin pointed out that the bees being an important part of how plants produce doesn't make sense to his ideas of
competition.
Competition, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It all suggests that, you know, this narrow view of survival of the fittest is just that. It's too narrow, and that actually the natural world works more through cooperation, interactions, reciprocal relationships, and if there was some way that we could, you know, emulate that with our societies in some way, instead of emulating the competition survival element and then start to think more about cooperation, then we might get somewhere.
Yeah, definitely. It's better to build than to fight.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
There's all I wrote about the note, and I think it's exactly what we're talking about now, was symbiotic ecology, and I assume that's basically what we're talking about now.
That's what we're talking about: symbiosis.
Yeah,
mutually beneficial relationships.
So one of the chapters talks about the evidence of psi beyond humans, and I would think at least some people are aware of Rupert Sheldrake's work with dogs, but it goes beyond that.
Yeah, well, some of the most interesting stuff I think has got to do with psi in plants. And again, this goes to this high strangeness thing, because we can relate to animals, we can relate to dogs, because they kind of, we live alongside them, we can kind of understand their motivations and their desires and what they're interested in. But plants, they express themselves in such a very different way, in quite what seems to us to be quite a cold and detached way. They don't seem to express their emotions or whatever in the same way that dogs do. And I think I talk about this a little bit, but in part that's to do with timescales and the different timescales that we live on. Plants express themselves over much longer periods of time than we do, and they move much more slowly than we do, so we don't relate to them in that kind of way. But then there's this issue then of psi in plants, and of it's much more highly strange than psi in animals, because plant consciousness is a crazy thing even in itself. There was a guy called what's his name? The guy who did experiments with lie detector machines on plants. Cleve Baxter. Yeah, and his initial conclusion was that there is that plants have some kind of a consciousness, that they have some kind of a baseline sentience. But then he also started to have telepathic communications from the plants, so they seemed to predict his actions before he'd even thought of doing them, and things like that, which murkies up the whole territory and makes it totally paranormal again. Yeah. Some of the things I find most interesting, this new field of plant neurobiology that's emerging, how long is it going to be before scientists have accepted that plants do have sentience, that they do have some kind of a consciousness? How long is it going to be now before they say, and actually also they seem to have telepathic abilities too? Hopefully not too long.
Yeah, that was one of the things you mentioned, is the time scale thing, and I thought that was really interesting, because you talk about how this might also apply to the paranormal. I mean, we're looking at this thing in the scope of our time frames, but the paranormal may have whatever is going on with the paranormal may have a much bigger time frame. And you see things like, for instance, in the Mothman prophecies with John Keel, where John had speculated that some of the information being given to him was out of order in time.
Yeah.
Like they're seeing this stuff from a completely different viewpoint. He compared it, I think, to if you lived in a two-dimensional world and you put your finger or your three-dimensional finger into it, the two-dimensional people wouldn't see the finger until suddenly it was there.
Yeah.
And then as soon as you removed it, it would just disappear. They wouldn't see that other range of movement. And so some of these intelligences may be looking at it where time is not a factor for them.
Mm-hmm. Or time is just, they interact with time in a different way.
Right.
So one of the examples that I use in the book was the example of yew trees. And yew trees can live to be, like 2,000 years old, at least. Mm-hmm. And what I found really fascinating when I was reading about yew trees is that, in a forest you have basically trees compete, they compete with each other. They also collaborate with each other, but they compete for sunlight in the forest. So a yew tree has this strategy where it can afford to wait like 500 years or something for another tree to grow above it and cover it over, because they live for 2,000 years. So, after 500 years, that other tree is going to die, and then it's going to have, another 1,500 years of access to all of the sunlight. It's really interesting to think that plants are doing these kinds of long-range strategic thinking you see what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
And if plants are doing this kind of long-range strategic thinking, then what about other forms of consciousness that might be out there? And it might help us to understand things like, I think I used the example of the Skinwalker Ranch and all of the weird stuff that was going on there. You know, perhaps these things would make sense if understood over a different timeline or a different time scale or something, that perhaps there is an intelligence there that's trying to make itself known, but like a yew tree or something that makes itself known over thousands of years. And we might get snippets of perplexing, you know, apparitions or weird portals or whatever appearing, but that's not the whole picture. I was also thinking about Skinwalker Ranch and wondering about the, you know, because it is a ranch and it's farmed land. And I was thinking about, you know, like how soil gets depleted and all of those kinds of things, and whether anyone's looked at the Skinwalker Ranch in terms of, you know, the ecology of the place, like how healthy is the land there? And, you know, perhaps all of this weird stuff, this, you know, terrifying weird stuff is an expression of anger, maybe, that the land has been mistreated, or that, you know, that the soils have been depleted, or, you know, whatever. Just a line of thought that I thought.
No, that's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it ties in with this whole landscape, you know, ecology way of thinking.
There was a weird comment that the original owners, when they sold it to the people who were living there when it was investigated, and they told them not to dig on the land. Yeah. Yeah. And it's like,
and then they did dig on it.
Yeah, exactly. But why would you say that? Like, what was behind that? I'd love to know the origin of that, if it was something very prosaic or that they knew it was going to stir stuff up.
Yeah. And it also rings of, you know, fairy kind of stuff as well. Don't go moving fairy boulders and all of that kind of thing.
And that makes me think of like the cycles. Like, you see cycles in a lot of this stuff. And are you aware of the book Robert Schoch did on psychic abilities?
Not specifically, though. I do know about Robert Schoch's work.
Well, he had co-authored a book on psychic research, and one of the things they found is that in laboratory tests, the psi research, the people being tested would perform better during high solar activity than low solar activity. Yeah. And that was, I mean, what he said to me was that it pretty much proves this stuff is real, because the only alternative is these people have had a century-long conspiracy to only get good results when there's high solar activity. Yeah. No, yeah. But yeah, I mean, again, the environmental, even cosmic factors that could be at play here. I mean, the sun is millions of miles away, but it still influences, you know, our psychic abilities, or I mean, not just psychic abilities, it influences everything. Yeah. So, you know, it doesn't make sense